did. My name is Doug Heiken. I'm with a conservation group called Oregon Wild, which is it started in Eugene about 40 years ago. It's now headquartered in Portland, but we have an office in Eugene with 2 people in it. And we've worked for 40 years to protect wilderness areas and old growth and endangered species like salmon and the spotted owl. And we're under, what we consider one of the greatest threats to our forests in a very long time, and we hope to work with all of you to stop that. And thanks a lot for coming out tonight. So the problem started, as Francis already described, during the 60s through the 80s. There was just a massive amount of clear cutting on our public lands. They were treating our public lands just like the private lands. They were logging right down to the streams. They were building logging roads right through our pristine wilderness areas. I mean, they weren't designated as protected wilderness yet, but they were doing their best to prevent wilderness from becoming established by building roads just about everywhere they possibly could. And it left us with a lot of ecological problems. There was polluted water, endangered species. Our old growth was liquidated down to just a mere fraction of what it used to be. Our wilderness areas were destroyed, and the public was understandably quite outraged. The Northwest Forest Plan was the culmination of many, many years of lawsuits and proving that the agencies had been violating the law, and bringing the scientists in and members of Congress coming together. And finally, the Northwest Forest Plan came out with a comprehensive effort to try to resolve these problems and protect our clean water and restore our forests and recover our endangered species. And the idea behind it was that the Forest Service and BLM needed to work together under the same set of rules to restore our forests. Instead of having 2 different agencies doing 2 different things, they were going to be working together in the future. We also need to protect clean water and salmon with much more generous buffers on all of our streams. And those buffers would not only serve to protect the stream and the salmon, but also allow corridors for wildlife to move across the landscape. And then there was these lake successional reserves, which is a fancy name for large blocks of habitat where old growth forests could not only be protected, but also restored. These reserves were established, but they were already mostly, or about 40% clear cut. And so we were going to restore those clear cuts back to an old growth condition and have healthy large blocks of habitat that would be distributed around the landscape. Through the first few years of implementation of the Northwest Forest Plan, there was some stumbling, and finally we kind of came to a successful strategy. The agencies figured out that if they would thin young forests, the places that they clear cut back in the 60s and 70s, and if they would thin those forests instead of clear cutting old growth, they wouldn't get sued anymore. And so the agencies started doing that fairly regularly. They started meeting their timber targets through this kind of thinning, and for about the last 10 or 15 years, they were very successful. And there's about 20 more years of that kind of work to be done. There's still lots of young stands that aren't even ready to be thinned yet because they're so young. They're still recovering from the clear cutting that occurred before the Northwest Forest Plan. So we would think that's the formula that works. And unfortunately, the current efforts are going to undo that. So, okay, here's a slide showing that BLM has met 84% of its predicted timber volume, 96% of the congressionally funded target. Congress tells the agencies, go out and cut X amount each year, and you get X number of dollars to cut X number of board feet. They've met 96% of that target. And so the complaints that BLM is shut down or that logging is not happening or forests need to be managed is just a complete myth, because the agencies are actually doing exactly what Congress is asking them to do. On this chart, you can see one dip this little dip here is one point where they were unsuccessful, and that's because we filed a lawsuit that proved that they were not following the Northwest Forest Plan, and the courts shut them down and told them to go back and do it right. And so there was a series of years when they built back up to a successful program. But this is kind of the end of clear cutting old growth, and this is the beginning of the thinning program. And this is the only time the agencies haven't been pretty much successful in meeting their timber targets after the Northwest Forest Plan was adopted. Francis already covered this fairly well, but the payments to counties, there was about 50% of the revenue from logging went to the counties, but that logging was unsustainable, and so the revenue was going to be unsustainable. there was inevitably going to be a decrease in logging when they ran out of old growth, or when they started to try to recover the spotted owl and the salmon. So the counties have screamed and yelled about that, and so Congress provided what they're calling the safety net, which is to provide the money from the Treasury instead of from logging. We call that decoupling. So the counties are no longer coupled to timber receipts. They're receiving the money independently, and the counties don't have to be cheerleaders for destroying our ecosystem. They can, be allies with us in trying to protect our ecosystem. Unfortunately, at one point, Wyden actually increased the amount of money that the counties were getting through that decoupling program. And that kind of created an unrealistic expectation among the counties that they're going to get that money forever, and they could even get more and more of that money. Unfortunately, Congress kind of, as Francis mentioned, became impatient and can't continue to sustain those generous payments to the counties, and the counties didn't come up with any solutions like raising their property taxes to at least a basic average level across Oregon. They're far below average now. And so the counties are kind of left scrambling, not knowing what to do, and that's part of the predicament we're in. If we tried to use our forests to fund the counties, it would be an ecological disaster. We would have to increase logging by 10-fold on our public lands in order to meet the current level of funding they're getting through the Secure Rural Schools Act. And so, that's just not realistic. We're not going to increase logging by 10-fold. That would be illegal at so many levels. So the proposals that we see coming out in recent years are to increase logging by 3 to 5 times. So it would merely be a huge increase in unpopular clear-cutting of older forests to achieve a massive reduction in the amount of money the counties are getting. So it's a lose-lose proposition. We would have a harmed ecosystem, and our county funding would be dramatically harmed. But the bottom line is that counties need to come together to figure out a solution that doesn't require destroying our forests. Here's a brief outline of what the DeFazio Bill would do, the ONC Trust, Conservation, and Jobs Act. Francis mentioned this a little bit. 1.6 million acres would be put into a timber trust that's managed under fiduciary responsibility to maximize revenue. That's basically legal shorthand for you have to clear cut it on a short rotation basis in order to maximize revenue to the counties. If you don't clear cut, if you thin, then you're not maximizing revenue. If you have long rotations and allow older forests to develop before you clear cut, you're not maximizing revenues. So this is a formula for basically short rotation clear cutting, just like you see on private lands. Another thing I want to point out here is the configuration of BLM lands in Western Oregon. This map doesn't show it, but there's national forest lands in the Cascades and national forest lands in the Coast Range. And BLM lands are like a land bridge that link up habitat in the national forests. And if BLM does not play a role in providing this land bridge, then populations become isolated in the national forests, and they become genetically degraded and will not persist over time. It's a recipe for extinction if we continue, or if we adopt proposals to clear cut those lands. So by the numbers, this 1.6 million acres is made up of several different categories of lands. There's 1.26 million acres of ONC lands on BLM lands. But there's also ONC lands on the national forests. A lot of people don't realize it, but underneath our national forests, there are some ONC lands that are included in the legislation. That includes places like Mount June and Hardesty Mountain. So it shocks a lot of people to realize, but there's 250,000 acres of these ONC lands that we put into these clear cutting trusts. There's also public domain lands that have nothing to do with the ONC Railroad Act would be included in this legislation in clear cut. And then there's another obscure category called the Coos Bay Wagon Road lands. It's 53,000 acres. Then on the conservation side, DeFazio keeps saying that he's going to create an old growth reserve out of the old growth forest. But unfortunately, that's not quite true. There's about 850,000 acres that are over 125 years that he would transfer to the Forest Service, but they're not receiving any explicit protection. There's sort of protection to be determined. And the scientists or the agencies come up with a million reasons that we need to log the forest in order to save it. And so we're not really convinced that we're going to have those forests truly protected. The bill also includes a little bit of wilderness and wild and scenic river designations, but those are really just minor contributions. They're just trade-offs to try to make their proposal, their terrible proposal, look not quite as bad. So they're splitting the baby here, but they're not splitting the baby in a very fair way. So the guaranteed clear cutting bar is much higher than the might be protected bar. There's a bunch of problems with the DeFazio proposal. It would not be following the environmental laws as they're currently implemented on the federal lands. It's kind of pseudo-privatization of our federal lands. There's about 350,000 acres of stands that are under 125 years old, but they're more than 80 years old, which is what the scientists say when a forest begins to function as old growth. So 350,000 acres of stands that are beginning to function like old growth that would be clear cut. And that's outrageous. There's also 120,000 additional acres of stands that have 2 ages of trees. They have some young trees, so BLM calls them young, but they also have old growth trees in them, and there's no protection for those trees in the DeFazio bill. So those trees would also be protected. And the Northwest Forest Plan calls for restoration of young forests so they can become old growth. Not all of the young forests, but some of them. And the DeFazio bill would abandon that goal on a large portion of the BLM lands. So we've been working on restoration for a long time. We've been working on these thinning projects that set our forests up to become old growth. And now we consider kind of a slap in the face to take this hard work that we've done for 10 years and take these thin stands that we thought was being done for an ecological purpose, and now they would just be clear cut. So another big problem with the DeFazio bill is using the Oregon Forest Practices Act as the management guidelines. So they have grossly inadequate stream buffers. Scientific bodies just up and down for years have just said they're completely inadequate, and the Oregon Board of Forestry has done nothing to strengthen them. There's aerial spraying of herbicides allowed. I think we're going to hear a lot more about that later. There's very limited public involvement allowed through the Oregon Forest Practices Act. And clear cutting has terrible ecological harms, as you probably all are quite aware. Here's a description of how federal land buffers are much wider than private land buffers. You can't really see it here, but there's a much wider buffer on federal lands and a very skinny buffer on private lands. And if it's large streams get a little bit of buffer. If it's a small stream, which is all your headwater streams where all your landslides occur, they get 0 buffer. Here's bringing it down to a local level. This is what the checkerboard looks like in the McKenzie watershed. And so you see here some of the lands that the Eugene Water and Electric Board has identified as they'd like to see priority protection given to these lands, but there's additional lands, BLM lands, in that watershed as well. These are in the Mohawk watershed, and they're above the intake for Eugene, so UWEP doesn't care quite as much about those. Here's the map showing the O&C lands on the national forests. Here's Cottage Grove. Here's all your wonderful tributary streams here, and the Mount June Hardesty area is in here. So that checkerboard would be up for clear cutting under the DeFazio bill. And the key here is really Wyden. The House is probably going to do something outrageous, and Wyden is now chair of a committee that is going to do something slightly less outrageous, but he hasn't told us exactly what that is yet. He's rejected the idea of the timber trust, luckily, so he doesn't want to privatize our public lands, but he does want to increase logging. And he's likely to embrace reduced stream buffers, reduced protection for older forests, and we really need to push on Wyden. He's kind of a key player in this whole thing. So there's also a new style of clear cutting that is being embraced in this bill. It's called variable retention harvest, and it's basically areas where you clear cut part of a stand and leave part of it not clear cut. If you're standing in the part that's clear cut, it feels like a clear cut. And so this is a picture of an actual variable retention harvest that was logged under the guidelines that will be adopted in this bill. This is the buck rising sale outside of Roseburg. That's our public lands. And we have this alternative that we think will work a lot better, which is to focus on restoration, continue decoupling of the counties from the timber receipts so that the counties get money in other ways, not from destroying the environment. We need to protect and restore all the public values that come from our forests. We get clean water, we get carbon storage that stabilizes our climate, we get endangered species recovery, we get recreation and quality of life, and the quality of life is really the foundation for economic development in the future. So those are the things that our public lands should be managed for. So we need to retain the Northwest Forest Plan and improve upon it if we can. We also want to try to find creative solutions to the county funding problem. We're not going to get it from logging, we hope, but maybe we could get it through a combination of shared responsibility. As we put out a report that talks about, how can the counties come up with a portion of the money they need, the state could come up with a portion of the money they need, and the feds could come up with a portion. And through that shared effort, we could try to make the counties more financially stable. So we've come out with an ad campaign. We're actually trying to buy ad space in the airports in Oregon. We've actually got them in the Eugene Airport already to highlight, that Oregon has this dirty little secret known as clear cutting, and we don't want more of it. So that's getting some good attention. Here's just people out in their BLM or wildlands enjoying the place. And I guess I'll end it there.